Okay, ladies and gentlemen, let's talk about wants and needs. We know economics is the study of how people make choices to deal with scarcity. We know that scarcity is limited resources to fulfill unlimited wants and needs. But what really are that second part there? What are wants and needs in a very economic, literal sense? Well, they're related to people's own self interest, which is economics rule number one. Everybody has different sets of wants and needs, even though needs have a greater commonality. In the AP6, this is represented by six different cultures, and we're going to relate them to our own. We have the UK, Russia, Iran, Nigeria, Mexico, and China. Understand that on the AP test and for this class, unless I explicitly allow you to, do not use the United States as an example on anything. We are going to learn about the United States because you got to learn about your own government, but also its relationship in terms of comparing it to everybody else. Let's take a look at families. All right. This is the United States, the UK, Russia, China, Iran, Nigeria, and Mexico. If you look at these pictures for a while, I mean, they have something in common. They're all families, they all have kids, they all have some kind of like happy look. If you look in the background, there's some symbolism going on. But if you actually look more, you're going to start looking at that there is a kind of culture that exists that might tell you a story about what these different societies actually value. And of course, values are beliefs and practices in your life that are very important to you. Those values build upon what not only an individual wants and needs, but also society wants and needs. Okay. They might have different priorities or ideas or structures in place to deal things like work or community or growth. And understand that most cases in cultures and their values aren't wrong, they're simply different. Are there some values we would call morally probably reprehensible? Of course. But for the most part, when you think about like the value norms of a different society, don't think about it as necessarily bad. Think about it as different. But if you take a look at these again, we're going to talk about culture because you can't understand a society unless you understand its culture. But the big part of culture we want to focus on is the one you may be missing by looking at all of this. And that is that bottom one that I just added in. That is government. The values of a people and a society about how they feel about government. This is known as political culture. This is the beliefs and values about government and politics. This is a big part of a social and individual's value system and set. In the United States, there's a lot, that can be seen and said about the beliefs and values about how people feel about government involvement in people's lives, how much it interferes, how much it helps, all the things it does to you. And so our connection with political culture and values, then needs and wants, you start to build this understanding about how scarcity really works. This set of pictures actually has a lot of government that exists within it in political culture. I'll point out all of them. Down here in Russia, of course, that male is probably going to go to war and probably going to die because most of the males in Russia, many of the males are going to fight in a war they've lost 500,000 people in already. So the government has a huge influence on the culture and values of the people because the government can take the male to go fight in Ukraine. Notice the red here in the Chinese family. Red is a big time political signaler in China. It's a representation of Mao's communist vision of China. Okay. You'll notice the vibrant clothing. You'll see a lot of different styles in Nigeria. This is because a lot of the clothing is based on the ethnic group that you come from. And that ethnic group has everything to do with political culture because you'll tolerate, political culture coming from your ethnicity often, but not the political culture coming from somebody else's ethnicity because ethnicity is much bigger than nationality in a place like Nigeria. Mexico, notice the flag, like right here on the tablecloth and in the banner in the back room. That's simple patriotism / nationalism. Happens all the time, but it is part of political culture. Notice the women in this picture in Iran wearing the hijab, which is the headscarf, because they are Muslim and they are required by law to have a hijab. Okay. This family in the UK has children. Those children were probably birthed from a hospital that belongs to the National Health Service, which is the government funded healthcare system that exists within the UK. So obviously, government has an influence on their lives. These two people out of this couple are probably, I'm going to guess, married. And if they're married, that means they need a marriage license. This means the government acknowledges that they actually are husband and wife. And it might not seem like that big a deal until you realize the government is actually giving you permission to engage in the act of being married. So then you have like issues of what happens to your estate and what happens to your kids and what happens to your taxes. That all shifts and changes around. All right. So political culture is a big part of what goes on in terms of wants and needs. Again, got to reframe your thinking. In a place like the United States, you're like, everybody should grow their own food and people should buy local and da 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 da. That's the best way to do things. And it's like when you're in Nigeria, it's like, I would rather not grow my own food. I would like this woman to probably get a career and a job and education and go to college and get her kids a better life. And that's not going to involve growing food on your own land. That's somebody else that grows food more efficiently so she can go do something else. So what you value is going to be different depending on the culture and the climate of where you're at. So when you start talking about like greenhouse gas emissions, you might, sure, of course, climate change isn't great, but then you're going to have to get a culture that is okay with air conditioning or higher prices, different ways to achieve that. Do people want solar panels on their land? Are you going to be able to go to a country like Nigeria or Mexico and tell them, oh, yeah, you can't have cheap air conditioning because you're not allowed to burn coal or oil? They're not going to be very happy with that. Or you could be a place like Europe that literally thousands of people die every year during heat waves because they have decided not to install air conditioning. Is that a good trade-off? That's a values-based judgment. But economically speaking, we would rather not have people die during heat waves. We'd rather have them have air conditioning. So again, the values are just simply different. And even COVID, in East Asia, people wear masks all the time when there are outbreaks of different kinds of viruses. So having a mask was not a big deal. Come to the United States, and we literally had a pandemic that killed 1.1 million people, and people were protesting having a mask on. You can argue or debate where a mask would be effective, but the idea that people were debating this, culturally, it was just a different value set in America than East Asia. A lot of this stems from when you start looking at the overall structure in values, the difference between needs and wants. And pretty much the materialist values, the physiological needs, these are absolute needs. Things like air, water, shelter, sleep, clothing, reproduction, the ability to do that. Your personal security, employment, health, all those things need to be met before you can believe in things like friendship or community or family or the sense of connection, self-esteem, and then the desire to be what you can be. Materialist values are going to be probably in poorer countries in terms of they are poor because they can only meet these materialist values. Post-materialist societies can afford to think about things like climate change and civil rights and that kind of thing because they've had these bottom ones met already. So a more materialist country is going to be a place like Nigeria. It is poor because it struggles to meet the materialist values down at the bottom. These are the basic needs that people need. As you go up farther to love, esteem, and self-actualization, you're probably going to be a wealthier country where you can think about those things and not worry about where am I going to sleep or what am I going to eat. So a place like the United States and the UK are very clearly post-materialist societies. People that are arguing about things like trans rights or immigration reform or that kind of thing, these are people that aren't worried about the basic necessities of life, and so they go into other things. That's not bad. It's just that when you look at economic growth, why you want economic growth is so people can be concerned about climate change and not worry about what they're going to eat or the fact that they don't have adequate housing. So some basic ideas then here is that values are going to determine what the consumer needs and wants. And a consumer is someone who purchases goods and services. Okay. So the producers out there supply those, but the values that the consumer desires are going to determine needs and wants. So needs are obviously something the body needs to survive: your food, water, clothing, and shelter. Wants are something that is desired, whether that's a car or a book or refrigerator or a smartphone. All those things, by the way, are convenient. They are not something that would be considered a need. Healthcare, internet, climate friendly goods, these things can be often debated about whether they are needed. A lot of it is relative, like healthcare for a teenager is on average way less necessary than healthcare for somebody who's 90 years old. Okay. So, again, consumers are someone who purchases goods and services and our needs and wants. Producers use the needs and wants that people want to create goods and services. A producer is someone who makes actual goods and services. In this class, goods and services actually have definitions. A good is any physical object, like a car or salt or a book or a pencil. Those are a good, something you can actually, I can touch this, okay? A service is an action performed for someone: a dentist, a teacher, a plumber, a salon. Okay. Most jobs in the United States have transitioned over time. First, it was agriculture in the early part of our history. Then we became a goods based economy when you had like more factories and factory work. We are now majority a service economy. More people perform something for somebody else to meet those wants and needs of that person. Okay. So we have our wants and our needs. That is half of the definition of scarcity. Can a business actually be both a good and a service? Well, think about a high performing restaurant. It's both giving you good food and a great experience.